I said I would give us until 11:02. We're here. I am happy to introduce my colleague and friend, Nolan Gray. Nolan is a former city planner in New York City. He is a PhD candidate at UCLA. He is the author of Arbitrary Lines, which I have to say, as somebody who's in these issues up to my neck all the time, is probably the best book on the history and current challenges of our zoning system. And he is the director of research at California YIMBY. Nolan, thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks so much, Greg. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let me kick us off by asking you to give us the big picture. How did we get here in terms of our current zoning regime across the country? And how would you characterize the challenges today?
It's a big question. So, I think until 2 or 3 years ago, I think many places thought of the housing affordability crisis as a coastal problem, as maybe a problem that was potent in California and New York and maybe a handful of other places. But of course, over the last 2 or 3 years, this crisis has gone national, and in places where there already was a housing affordability crisis, it's deepened. I think a really important part of that conversation is, of course, zoning. So zoning is the way that we regulate urban growth in cities. And essentially what we've ended up with is, after 100 years of increasingly stricter regulation, we've ended up with a system where it's very, very hard to build housing, where it's illegal to build many types of housing, and where the housing that can be built is subject to long and expensive and risky permitting processes. And what we've inevitably ended up with, of course, is the housing affordability crisis and shortage that we have today. The good news is that there's a lot of conversation happening about zoning reform, both at the local and the state level. Of course, local governments have huge authority to remove a lot of these rules and to streamline the processes and help get a lot of housing built. But, of course, solutions are going to vary based on city, based on local politics. But I think this is really a moment where local leaders have an opportunity to really move the ball on the issue.
Your framing of it's very interesting because, of course, zoning got its it may not have gotten its philosophical start with exclusionary intent, but about 5 minutes after zoning for cities became an idea in the early part of the 20th century, it was used to keep undesirable populations away from more desirable populations. And it's interesting to see that a regime that was meant to be exclusionary to some groups has in essence metastasized and become exclusionary to just about anybody who wants to build something innovative, wants to be able to afford a home in their hometown. We've got a report coming out on the history of zoning that I think is pretty complementary to your work in about a month, and so it'll be interesting to explore that topic further. Would you say zoning is the heart of our housing challenges, or is it just one piece of the puzzle?
To the first point that you were making there, I think that's exactly right. That part of what's changed over the last few years is, historically, of course, some groups have always had issues with housing affordability, right? Folks who, think of the single mother or the retiree on a fixed income, right? There's certain populations that always needed a little bit of help to find affordable, decent housing. But what we've really seen over the last few years is folks are saying, well, my kids can't afford to buy a home within 2 or 3 hours of where I live. I can't afford to retire in my current community. What you're seeing is families being broken up, communities being broken up, and these issues affecting folks who historically never had a housing affordability issue. So many folks, of course, young millennials looking to start families are realizing there's not a path to homeownership here. And of course, that's just a huge threat to the long-term stability and health of our communities.
Right. So one of that brings up this broader point, and we're not a housing first organization at BCP. We look at a lot of different issues related to local governance, but part of what we've just come to find is that housing is adjacent to every challenge every community faces, right? If you're a rural community and you want growth, housing's part of that mix. If you are a thriving urban downtown and you want to increase your tax base, housing's a part of that. If you're in a suburb honestly, if you're in a suburb that wants to grow, or like a lot of suburbs, you want to put a glass dome over it, housing's going to be part of figuring out that as well. So against that backdrop, I wonder, I wonder what other things you think should be addressed in parallel with zoning reform. And I understand I'm sort of putting the cart before the horse because we haven't gotten into specifics of zoning reform yet, but I'd like people to have a bigger picture of some of the things in addition to zoning reform that might be on a pro-growth, pro-housing agenda.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, the way I frame it in the book is that I think a lot of these reforms are necessary, but not sufficient conditions for building the types of cities and communities we want. So, of course, if you have rules that make it illegal to build virtually any new housing in your community, or if you have rules that just make it prohibitively difficult or force all that housing to be really expensive, it's going to be a lot harder to solve all of your other issues, right? Regardless of how many public subsidies you put into projects, or regardless of how nice the planning documents are, if the zoning is not there, of course, you're not going to be getting the types of communities you'd want to see. Of course, there are other things that do need to happen. Of course, growth is challenging for local governments. You have to have a plan to increase public service provision. You have to have a plan for additional public infrastructure that ideally is mostly being covered by the marginal expenses required for new growth. It's easier said than done. But I think what we've done in the US here is, for the past 100 years, is so many jurisdictions have taken an approach of, well, growth is hard, so we're just not going to do it. We're just going to block any new development, and our community is gradually going to stagnate and die. I don't think that's sustainable in the long term. And I think we have to actually embrace this challenge of saying, yeah, we need to allow some growth to allow folks to stay here, to be the type of healthy, diverse community we want to be. We need a plan to do it. And of course, you need plans for scaling up public services. You need plans for infrastructure provision that are fiscally sustainable in the long term.
So you've touched upon what I think of as the three problematic legs of the stool in terms of housing, right? There's a policy issue, which guys like you and I think about. There's the political issue, which anybody who's elected on this webinar is doubtlessly thinking about. But we've just got a fundamental problem of language to address too, because when you and I talk about growth, I guarantee you there are people in rural communities on the webinar right now who are worried that somebody's going to show up and want to put a high-rise condo in their backyard, right? And that's not necessarily what thoughtful zoning and housing policy looks like, right? There are communities that rightfully want to keep their character, whatever that character may be. And oftentimes elected officials are elected on the promise of maintaining that character. So the needle that we need to thread, and again, I think it's both a policy question, but it's also a political and a rhetorical issue, is, okay, what do we mean when we mean growth? There's a town, I could hop in the car right now and drive up to Lake Tahoe. It's about 20 minutes away. Lake Tahoe is not a cheap place to live. It's a tourist destination. The housing's extraordinarily expensive. One of the challenges they're facing is that they run on a service economy, and their service workers can no longer afford to live in the community. So growth for them is going to look very different than, a suburb, a near suburb to a major metropolitan area, for example. None of that's a question, but I just wanted to sort of frame that when we start talking about growth, and I do that. You speak all over the place. I know you do, because I love your work. I speak a lot on this subject. I know that when you walk into a room and you talk about growth, immediately you lose a percentage of the room, right? And so, for those watching the webinar right now, I would really encourage in your questions, like, what do you think? I'd just like to know what growth looks like in your community according to your vision. And you know what? Saying we want to put a glass dome over it is a fine answer, as long as you accept that, okay, there are costs that come with that, right? Anyway, let's move on, because you're in California working for California YIMBY, and California, which was my hometown for the first, my home state, pardon me, for the first 30 years of my life. California could not solve its housing gridlock at the local level. They just couldn't. And so the state eventually stepped in with some reforms. So I'd like your input on what lessons there are in terms of successes in the Golden State for that approach. But I'd also like your thoughts on what cities can do locally, frankly, to get out in front of the threat of state preemption, because I don't know a local official in the country who would prefer a state first solution.
Right. Well, I mean, the ball is really in local government's court on a lot of this issue. So local governments in most states have extremely wide latitude in how they administer zoning. And a lot of the rules and processes that make it really hard to build, they actually are empowered already to reform those. And, here in California, we see a lot of local leadership. I'm always hyping up San Diego, I think, really as a leader, certainly relative to Los Angeles, on sort of cracking open the books and saying, hey, what are some of the rules that are standing in the way of the type of development that we actually know we want to keep our community affordable and to keep folks who grew up here in the community, without disrupting necessarily the quality of life or the character of the place. And I think they've been very successful at that. The problem is that many jurisdictions don't rise to the occasion and don't really take on issues like zoning reform. So a good example here, I had a piece recently in the Atlantic on accessory dwelling unit legalization in California. Now, a lot of folks know that over the last 5 years, California has legalized accessory dwelling units statewide. What a lot of folks don't know is that the state first tried to do this in 1982. The state government said to local governments, hey, we're encouraging you to adopt an ADU ordinance to allow an additional home, maybe in a garage or in an attic or in a basement. Please adopt an ordinance. You can do whatever you want with that ordinance. And if you really don't want to adopt an ordinance, you can write a book report and we'll exempt you. And of course, what happened over the next 40 years is many local jurisdictions just didn't write an ADU ordinance. They didn't write an ordinance that was workable. And really what they were doing is they were actually just denying their local homeowners, their local residents, the right to do something that many folks would do before zoning, and many folks now that it's legal are happily doing. And so what the state ended up doing is coming in and saying, well, we're just going to develop a statewide set of rules to where we are protecting homeowners' rights to build accessory dwelling units. And what we've seen is a big housing boom. Now, of course, as I say, there's a lot of things that local governments can do to lead on this issue. And in my book, I highlight, for example, Houston dropping minimum lot sizes down. So no longer saying, hey, we're not going to allow any homes unless you have a 5,000 square foot lot. Now you can have it on a small 1,400 square foot lot. And as land prices increase, that's been extremely important to making sure that your local working and middle class families have a path to homeownership. Cities all across the country saying, hey, we're going to get rid of some of these really, really restrictive parking mandates that force, every strip mall to have this huge parking lot that's never empty, that's never completely full, not even on Black Friday. The folks over at another group, Strong Towns, they have this thing every Black Friday where they go out to what should be the busiest day of the year to a strip mall in suburbia, and of course, half of the parking lot is sitting empty. Right. In many cases, that's because of local rules that don't allow that property to actually use that land more efficiently, or similar things with use rules. Right? I talk to so many local governments where they're kind of in a panic because they have all of this office space, and they're it might be down market office space, and they're not really sure what they're going to use that property for. And I look and I say, well, hey, your current zoning actually doesn't allow this to be anything other than a suburban office park. You're never going to be able to take this and turn it maybe into small lot, single family homes or townhouses, or maybe a little town center project that would actually enrich the community and be fiscally really, really positive. And so, I think there's a lot of low hanging fruit here for local governments to lead on the issue. I would say another thing too, just thinking about the politics, I find that when local governments first started having these conversations, of course, the same half dozen group of people who show up at every Tuesday 10 a.m. meeting show up and of course yell and scream and talk about how it's going to destroy the community. And I'm always trying to assure local electeds that's not representative of the average person in your community. And in many cases, when we do polling or survey work and we ask people, what are your most important issues? They say housing affordability, they say homelessness. You ask them, hey, we could come up with solutions to incrementally add housing in a small scale way that doesn't actually disrupt the community character, and in many cases enriches communities. And folks are actually really excited about that. And once you get 2 or 3 of these reforms passed, and of course the sky doesn't fall, then I think actually the folks who were out in front on this issue start to seem like leaders. I've seen that happen in many cases.
So I want to drag another BCP project into this discussion because it's really relevant. We did a case study recently on Auburn, Maine, which is a relatively small city in Maine that enacted a series of housing and zoning reforms, and it's relevant. And Sarah, maybe you can throw a link to the Auburn study up in the chat box. It's particularly relevant because they did ADUs on steroids. They had a lot of older homes on larger lots, and what they found when they loosened the restriction and allowed accessory dwelling units, they specifically allowed for ADUs that were larger than the original home. And what happened to a lot of these lots is they became multi-generational housing compounds, right? The kids moved back in with their kids to the new home. The parents were able to age in place. But the other thing there that I think is worth everybody on this webinar reviewing the Auburn study is there's a page in that report about public opinion and about the ways they went about assessing, and it wasn't qualitative, it was quantitative. They were able to assess the gap in opinion between the vetocracy that shows up at the meetings saying no to everything versus the segment of the public that was actually calling the city hall for information to try and see what they could do with their property versus the larger public and what they thought of it. And that gave them a lot of confidence to pursue reform when they saw that, okay, not only is there a gap, there's a staggering gap in public opinion, and we would frankly be going in a direction our community didn't want us to go if we only paid attention to the attendees in those meetings. So let me go back to something we said earlier on. I made this throwaway comment that people in more rural areas, when you mention allowing housing reform, zoning reform, what you get are people worried about multifamily housing in all of its myriad shapes showing up in their single bedroom communities, right? And particularly in more exurban and rural areas where, the average lot size might be an acre. I mean, in some of these communities, the average lot size might be 5 acres, right? And so do they have a point in their fears?
I think of course, it depends on the context, right? I mean, just to riff on something you raised, right? In a rural context like around Lake Tahoe, I think there probably is enormous development pressure. And I do think you have to be very careful about how you manage that and how you think through that. But in your typical rural area, though, I think the type of additional housing stock that's needed or that's likely to come is, for example, more homes on slightly smaller lots or ADUs or small developments around a town center. And I think this is where I think the framing is actually very important. I think many rural governments, many rural jurisdictions take an approach of, well, we're just going to try to stop everything. We're going to do everything we can to block anything from getting built. And it's not really the high rise, right? I mean, the nice thing about land prices is that they broadly kind of organize how density gets allocated. You're not going to really get a tower in a lot of these contexts, but you might have had a few more small, ADUs getting built in a couple more backyards, or a few more single family homes on slightly smaller lots that are more affordable to young families that maybe want to stay in the community. And I think what governments do when they just block that over the course of decades, they don't eliminate that demand. What they do is they bottle it up. They put themselves in a situation where the moment that they relax some of these rules, they do get this boom in development that actually does disrupt character. So of course, I think really the choice facing a lot of jurisdictions is, do we allow for small incremental growth that doesn't really disrupt the community character, but keeps our place affordable keeps our community intact? Or do we bottle up all of this growth and demand to a place where the pressure just gets so high that there is at some point going to be this explosion of new development that actually does disrupt quality of life and comes at a rate where we can't actually do the type of planning needed to keep quality of life high. So, I would say embracing this approach to incremental small scale growth that cities really saw and rural areas saw even before the rise of zoning is a more sustainable path in the long term. I think really folks who are in government are doing their constituents a disservice when they say, yeah, well, we're just going to stop any new development. Nothing's going to get built under my watch. Of course, that's raising housing costs and excluding folks who might want to live in the community in the near term. But in the longer term, it's just setting up the community for this boom and growth that's going to be very disruptive and very painful.
I'm going to resist the temptation to ask you to call out a city that did that, because I don't want to embarrass anybody who might be on the call. But I know what you mean, and I've seen it around the country. A lot of this so far has been a conceptual discussion about the sort of the nature of the problem and what we need to do. I'd like to deep dive now, if you can. Let's talk about 3 things. That's an arbitrary number. If you come up with 4, nobody's mad. What 3 things should every city and county represented on this call be looking at right now to address their housing and zoning challenges?
It's a great question. I would say that the minimum viable zoning reform here is legalizing accessory dwelling units. Like I say, allowing those small apartments, allowing homeowners to build those small apartments and maybe unused garages or unused basements or unused attics. Of course, this is just a political win on every score, right? Homeowners like it because it gives them an additional source of income. Renters get an additional source of housing. And, traditionally, these things are called granny flats or mother-in-law units, which besides being cute is like indicating many of these ADUs are built to keep aging parents or young adult children nearby, folks who might otherwise not have been able to afford to stay in the community. So I'm finding so many jurisdictions are passing ADUs, not only not facing a whole bunch of controversy, but actually facing a lot of homeowners who are kind of eager to build these things. So that's, I think, one bit of low-hanging fruit. I would say too, in more urban or suburban context, eliminating a lot of those minimum parking requirement rules for uses that force developments that have these huge parking lots or these huge parking garages. In many cases, these parking mandates, which really second guess developers and say, regardless of what we think the prospective tenant wants in terms of parking, we're going to force a whole bunch of it to be built. In many cases, that can make projects infeasible. And when it doesn't make projects infeasible, it makes them more expensive. And of course, it actually causes more traffic, right? It just generates more traffic. So in more urban and suburban context, I would say eliminating these mandates is also very positive, low-hanging fruit. My hometown of Lexington, Kentucky, eliminated them citywide. Of course, they were feeling a whole bunch of pressure from developers who were saying, hey, I have this strip mall, exactly this case that we were just talking about. I have this strip mall, and I'm not ever filling these parking lots, and I can use some of those out parcels to maybe build a few more shops or to build, small apartment buildings or townhouses in an area where it's not really going to disrupt any residential neighborhood. That's, I think, very low-hanging fruit. The third is, particularly in more suburban or rural context, reevaluating your minimum lot size rules. So what minimum lot size rules say is that we're not going to allow you to subdivide a property below some threshold. And so, for example, in many cases, you can't build a single family home unless you have, let's say, 10,000 square feet. In places where land prices are very high, that's basically putting a really high price floor on the housing that gets built. And in many cases, those projects consume, those large lot single family homes actually are a fiscal loser. They consume a lot more in public services because now you have to lay out sewer and water lines even further, power lines, you have to pave even more street frontage. As opposed to maybe a smaller, a cluster of homes on 2,500 square foot lots that would be affordable to actual working and middle class families that are in your community. Part of what I have to do with the minimum lot size piece is I think there needs to be a reset in what we think of as a starter home. I think in many cases, I talk to a lot of local policymakers, and their notion of a starter home is what it was maybe when they bought their home in the 70s or the 80s. Might be a ranch style or a Cape Cod, home on a 7,500 square foot lot with a 2-car garage. And as land prices go up and the cost associated with everything goes up, that's not really a starter home anymore. And in many cases, those homes might be only affordable to folks earning 150 to 200% of the area median income. The starter home of today might be that single family home on a small lot. It might be a townhouse. It might be a condo in a small multifamily building. Those are the smaller housing typologies that give families their first step on the ladder of homeownership. And we've basically criminalized that in many communities. And I think removing a lot of those barriers is really low hanging fruit.
Well, and on that third point, that really cuts to the heart of housing being adjacent to so many other community goals, right? Because the young families or young singles that need starter home stock, those are also probably the majority of your workforce in most communities. If not an outright majority, then certainly the fat part of the middle of that curve. And if they don't have a place to live, they're probably not in their peak earning years yet, so they can't live 30 or 40 miles away from where they work. It's not economically sustainable when you're just starting out in your career. So making sure that those young families have a place to live in your community is a big part of not just solving for housing, but solving for economic health. And on that point, one of the things that was done in Auburn, Maine, that I just can't emphasize enough is go talk to the large employers in your community. Talk to them about what their future growth plans are, about what problems they're having hiring people. Now, some of that, admittedly, is not solved by housing, but what you may find is that they are eager to work with you on solutions that allow them to get more of that median wage and below worker who's maybe not a tech bro, maybe not making six figures or multiples of six figures at a tech startup, but maybe they work in a medical facility, or maybe they work in a factory. Those people need places to live. And one of the things they found in Auburn, I hate to keep coming back to Auburn, but I love the case study so much, right? Is they had economic development happen precisely and explicitly because of their change in housing policy. They had employers say, yeah, we weren't going to build, now we will build because we know that there's going to be a place for the workforce. Now, if you're in the city of Los Angeles, that's not a meaningful conversation, right? But most places are not sprawling metropolises. Most places, the house work link is relatively closely tied geographically. So, I suspect I was looking over the list of who joined the call before we jumped on. We don't have, I think we don't have many economic development professionals on this call, but for my colleagues who are in housing and planning and sitting on city councils and county seats, go talk to your economic development people. Ask them to put their ears to the ground about this. You will be surprised at how it comes back to impact the housing decisions you make.
Yeah, I'll just say two quick points on this. I think for your typical U.S. mid-sized city or even rural area, one of your big comparative advantages in attracting investment is a affordable standard of living. Right. And firms will, they know, we've seen this in Southern California. So many firms have left the region because they say, look, I just can't pay people enough to convince them to move here. And they will move to more affordable metros. And then, of course, the investment follows where you can actually attract the talent that you need. So I think this is a huge consideration. The second thing I'll say is this is also upstream of your public service costs. There are so many jurisdictions in California that cannot keep the bus drivers local. They cannot keep their firefighters, their teachers local. It's incredibly expensive. And what we get is this crazy situation where now local governments are saying, well, we're going to build some housing and only the teachers are going to be allowed to live in it. Or we're going to build some housing and, only public servants are going to be allowed to live in it. Arguably, those are not the folks who I mentioned at the top of the call. Those are really not the folks who, like the low-income senior on a fixed income or the single parent, those are not people who should be relying on charity to have access to decent, affordable housing. Those are people who, if we just allowed new market rate housing to be built, would be housed in decent, affordable housing. But because we put such a tight constraint on it, you have local governments having to get into the business of building teacher housing or having to pay all of their folks incredibly high rates. And that's just, of course, impoverishes local residents.
Incredibly helpful input. We're going to have to go to questions soon because they're starting to pile up. But on ADUs, which you and I agree are the low-hanging fruit, help our audience out. What are the characteristics of an outstanding ADU ordinance? And what pitfalls are characteristic of a bad one?
Well, there are as many bad ADU ordinances as there are NIMBY jurisdictions in America. I'll say a couple things. There's two things to consider here. I think there's the substance and there's the process. As far as the substance goes, you want ADU rules that don't place a ton of restrictions on new development outside of the actual impacts that these developments have. I think it's perfectly appropriate to say, hey, we're going to have 4-foot side and rear setbacks if you want to do a detached ADU. We're going to have some baseline provisions, rules that, of course, protect the safety of the residents. But you need to have a framework that allows for homeowners to easily build these on their property. And what I would do is go out and look at a few indicative properties. Go out and look at a few typical properties in your community that you might think like to host an ADU, and just hire an architect or hire a developer to help you think through. Hey, is this feasible? Are the rules that we've written actually feasible? Don't load on a whole bunch of different rules that I see in so many ADU ordinances, like owner occupancy requirements, which say, well, you can only build an ADU on a property if the resident also lives in the primary residence. Those make it hard to get financing. Banks don't really know how to interact with all of that. And in many cases, they won't fund it. And then, of course, you don't get these projects. Don't just try to mandate that the new ADUs all be affordable without, unless you're willing to put up the money to have pretty high subsidies to make that pencil. Think through who is building these. And this gets to my second point, which is process. Make it very, very easy for a compliant project to go in and get their permit. Here in San Jose, I'm not used to saying nice things about Bay Area jurisdictions, but in San Jose, if you come in with a compliant application for an accessory dwelling unit, you get your permit the same day. The same day.
Is that based on pre-approved plans, or does a compliant application allow for custom plans?
They can be custom plans, but what they've done is they've created a framework of rules that are very clear and relatively flexible, and it's very easy for homeowners to figure out what the rules are and to comply with them. And they're rules that work on the typical lot. And so it's very easy for a homeowner, because this is another important consideration, right? The permitting, the rules and the permitting processes associated with ADUs have to be clear, simple, reliable. You have to know exactly what the process is going to be. Homeowners are not big developers. They've not done this before. They're not going to sit around and wait for 6 months, let alone 2 years, to get a special permit, or to go to 4 different agencies to get sign off from every single one. So of course, I think an ADU ordinance that works and makes sense, and there's a lot of great examples now across California because we've had so many great local governments who have actually tried to lead on the issue. Is simple, it's clear, it's reliable, and you'll get your permits relatively quickly.
One of the things we like to say about developers, and it's true about the average homeowner who wants to build an ADU as well, is, a developer, they understand and can deal with no. They'd like to hear yes, they can deal with no. What they really can't deal with, and this is true of homeowners and ADUs, is we'll see. That's absolute toxicity to innovation in housing is this. Yeah, we'll see. Maybe, you don't really conform to what we were thinking of. So, now you've got a special use permit, you've got a discretionary council vote, or whatever your process is. In communities where that is still the norm, I'm not at all surprised that things don't get built.
Can I say 2 very short things on this?
Sure.
I'd say another bit of low-hanging fruit here that's not zoning substance, but is process, is permitting timelines. I think local governments can lead on this, right? Yeah, you can have 2 comparably situated jurisdictions in California or across the country, and one will take 2 weeks to get a permit out for a fully legally compliant subdivision, and another will take 6 months. And there's no policy difference in many cases in these jurisdictions. It's just the culture of the agency, sufficient staffing, having a customer-oriented approach, right? You have so many jurisdictions where they treat people who are coming in to build compliant housing, the housing that the community needs, as if like there's this antagonistic relationship. To my mind,
as an example of that, there was one community that had adopted some housing reforms, was going to adopt more, and the city's planning staff actually approached the mayor and said, well, if you allow a bunch of ADUs, that's a big burden on the planning staff because there's all these plans to review. And their solution turned out to be, you know what, if the plans are stamped by a state licensed engineer or architect, you don't have to review them. Now, I'm not saying that's the right solution for every community, but it gets to the heart of some of those process driven questions, right? If opening up housing via zoning and process changes is seen as, oh, it's going to be more work, and so we have to figure out how to solve for the more work. Well, you're drowning the baby in the bathtub, right? before it gets a chance to do anything. We have several questions, and I think they're all interesting. And before I jump to them, I want to ask the sort of the banners in the breeze big question here. If cities and counties get this right, if they don't wait around and get state preemption, if they craft solutions that work within the context of their community, what do they get? What are the big benefits here?
It's a great question. They get a community where young folks don't have to immediately move away as soon as they finish high school or as soon as they finish their college degree. They get to set the terms for growth. If they don't just fight growth and say, hey, actually, we welcome growth and we're going to have clear terms for it, and this is how it's going to look, they can guide that growth in a way that enriches current residents and is actually fiscally and environmentally sustainable. And then they become attractive for just much more development. It's like I was saying earlier, I think many jurisdictions compete on, hey, we have an affordable standard of living here. Folks can move here. You can attract the type of talent that you want here. And so these are the places that just have broader economic growth. And I think this is so much more functional than what you see in some of these jurisdictions in the Northeast and on the West Coast, where they've said, we're just going to block everything. And what they end up with is, of course, every young person has to move away. Firms are moving away. Entrepreneurs aren't starting up businesses. Of course, you have homelessness crisis that's, immediately visible when you land in a place like Los Angeles. Not only do they avoid all of that, but they end up with communities in cases where jurisdictions lead on this issue and come up with plans to build the housing that's needed. They actually get so many more benefits in addition to avoiding these crises. I always say, in many cases, I talk in so many jurisdictions where they're not quite to a California housing crisis, but they have this notion of like, well, we don't have anything to learn from conversations happening in California. I would say to them, look, if you want to end up like California, just do nothing, right? Just keep all the rules you have on the books, and gradually you'll not build enough housing, and you'll have a housing affordability crisis, and you'll have visible street homelessness, and you'll have firms leaving. But if you want to avoid that fate,
that's really crucial rhetoric, right? The opposite of doing something is not preserving your community. The opposite of doing something is doing nothing and letting the situation metastasize into, all of the panoply of problems that we've seen in California. Boy, that's a good point, and I'm so glad you made it. You ready for some questions?
Let's do it.
I am going to, some of these are anonymous and some of them have names. I'm going to not mention names as we go through here. So I'm going to read these verbatim. We've been feeling lately like the well-intentioned assurances that additional housing growth and density can be accommodated in a manner that won't threaten community and neighborhood character may be reinforcing some of the underlying exclusionary mindsets. Have you found examples of YIMBY messaging strategies that can effectively make the case for growth and change in a way that sets the stage for more inclusive approach, for more inclusive approaches to addressing challenges of affordability? is the opposite of preserving character necessarily disruptive and painful?
So a few things going on in the question, and thank you for asking it. First I'll just say for sure, I think very often folks say preserving character and they mean something a little bit more nefarious. There might be underlying animosities there towards certain people or folks of certain incomes. I share the reluctance to lean into that. At the same time, I think you kind of have to meet people where they're at. And what I talk to folks who I think are perfectly well-intentioned, and they'll say things like, "Hey, I don't want my community to dramatically change." I would say a few things. First is most of the housing growth that we actually need to keep cities and communities affordable is not really going to dramatically change even the built character of the community, right? We're talking about things like duplexes. We're talking about things like ADUs. We're talking about things like maybe a couple more apartment buildings on some of your, near transit or some of your busier corridors, right? That's really the type of growth that it takes to keep many places affordable. Of course, in a place like Los Angeles or San Francisco, you probably are going to need pretty dramatic housing growth because we've stopped up housing for so many decades. But in your typical US city or suburb, that's really all you need. You just need a few more of these small projects, and that's okay. The second point I would make, though, and I make this often to groups, is I say the choice is not really between preserving character and building nothing, or losing your character and building housing. The choice is between, do we want our community to look exactly the way it does today, but the type of person who can afford to live here is dramatically different? Or do we want to live in a community where, yeah, maybe our community looks slightly different. We have maybe a few more ADUs and backyards, a few more duplexes, a few more small apartment buildings, maybe, God forbid, with corner groceries. But you know what? We're still a place where working and middle class families can raise kids. We're still a place where, someone can retire and downsize within their community without having to move away. That's really the choice facing a lot of communities. You can either look exactly the same and have your community in every meaningful sense dramatically change, or you can allow for a little bit more incremental housing growth and the community looks a little bit different, but the core, the heart of the community is actually the same.
Just to add on to that point, you mentioned, an apartment building that had, a corner grocery on it. That development pattern of commercial on the ground floor and residential above, that's what powered the growth of the U.S. Small cities that sprang up on the frontier and became mid-sized cities. That they all had that growth, that form of a main street or a couple of side streets that would have commercial with residential above it. So that's it's not something new and amazing. It's going back to something that people recognized was right. Let me move on here. I have been a development review planner for about 2.5 years. In that time, I've frequently swung back and forth between, quote, many of these regulations largely feel arbitrary, unquote, and, quote, it is important to have a set process to ensure everyone gets the same treatment, unquote. This is probably a clique question, but where's the balance there? How do we ensure processes that don't benefit one person over another without making people jump through hoops for the sake of it?
That's a really great question. So, I think what we've ended up with today is because we have zoning rules that are so strict that don't allow any actual development to happen as of right, or allow very little development to happen as of right, is that so much new development has to go through a discretionary permitting process. Of course, that entails public hearing, that entails in some states a whole environmental review that can add cost and delay to the process. But it also creates basically a pay-to-play system where, the type of thing we're dealing with now in Los Angeles, where because the rules are so strict and so much new development is discretionary, nobody really knows what the rules are. And I think you're exactly right that this system actually benefits precisely the wrong type of person. And you want clear, universal, consistent rules. I think, but we have to be clear, right? We have to have rules that actually work. We have to have rules that allow for the type of development that we need. Otherwise, we're just going to regress back into the system where we have so many discretionary applications. We have so many planned unit developments or PUDs where everything is discretionary, everything's up in the air. Nobody knows what can be built on any particular lot.
Next question. Many central city neighborhoods suffer from zoning that has been applied over the years, often making it illegal to build what was originally built. Not just small lots, but small multi-family units restricted by parking, open space, or setback requirements. What are the best practices for addressing this?
Yeah, so I mean, this is one way that I actually generally approach the zoning reform issue in many contexts. Is I find a a pre-zoning neighborhood, and in many cases, a neighborhood that folks actually really like and where home values are going up. And I simply point out that it would actually be illegal to build this neighborhood today, or it would be illegal to make some of our post-war neighborhoods more like this. I think a few things on this. So the first is I think that's a very effective way to message zoning reform, is to say, hey, we have, for example, we have minimum lot size rules, or we have single family zoning, or we have setback rules that make 60% of this neighborhood illegal, right? And that causes so many issues for homeowners or people who want to actually invest in that community, because now they have to go through all of this discretionary process. Of course, banks are going to be reluctant to underwrite anything because of all of these nonconformities. So I would definitely say, right, that's really the lowest hanging fruit actually of zoning reform, is to say, let's just have rules that just at least allow what already exists, right, and doesn't criminalize maybe the single family home on the 3,000 square foot lot that only has 4 foot, side setbacks. Like, okay, like the sky is not going to fall if we just admit, okay, this thing already exists and we're not going to make it illegal. So, a similar related point to this, in many cases, many local jurisdictions that I'll talk to, they have a main street, right? A traditional main street, one-story commercial with 2 or 3 stories of apartments or offices over top. And, something like half to 2/3 of that strip will be sitting kind of permanently vacant. And they don't want to demolish it because they recognize that this is a real asset. But at the same time, folks are worried we can't fill the spaces. And what I'll do is I'll crack open the zoning code, and in many cases, it will be illegal to actually use that property without getting variances from parking mandates, or without getting variances for a whole bunch of different site planning conditions, or getting some type of rezoning that allows you to actually lease out the apartments over top of the shop. So I would say, cracking open your codes and saying, hey, are our zoning codes actually stopping us from using and reinvesting in some of the communities that we already have?
On that, I can't stress enough that if you have a downtown merchants association or a downtown business association, or even just a chamber of commerce that has a vested interest in a thriving downtown, get them involved in the discussion, because they're you want it on 2 levels. One, they can be a powerful ally in helping you figure out what the community wants, that segment of the community wants. And frankly, a lot of downtown associations can be some of the strongest NIMBY voices, because they want to encase it all in a glass bubble and put it up on a mantle to look at. And talking to groups like that doesn't automatically mean they become your allies. But one of the things that we have seen working with cities around the country is an initial no can often start a dialogue that leads to a subsequent yes on various housing reforms. So even the we don't ever want to change anything crowd, it's much better to get out there and talk to them and get them into the tent talking to you. Even if your first at bat doesn't lead to the reforms that you may necessarily want.
I think that's the worst of cases, right? I think in the best of cases, you talk to these groups and they can tell you exactly what rules need to change to make something work. I mean, here in Westwood, where I'm on the neighborhood council, don't judge me too harshly. I'm on the neighborhood council, but we had business owners associated with the business improvement district saying, we cannot lease out all of these vacant commercial spaces. We can't lease them out because of all of these parking mandate rules that literally we don't have space on the lot to put the parking. And we worked with them to clear a lot of these barriers. And that's just opening up new investment. And so talk to folks, talk to the folks who are trying to build housing in your community, and ask and say, what are the rules that make this type of small scale incremental infill that we need? What are the rules that stand in the way of that? You don't have to buy my book, even though you should, or you don't have to, pull ideas out from, the void. In many cases, you have developers and entrepreneurs and small business owners in your community who will eagerly tell you, hey, here are the 3 rules that don't really serve any planning objective that are making my life harder.
Right. I don't necessarily recommend this as the approach for every city under the sun, but if you are unfamiliar with the story of New Rochelle, New York, it's really worth going and looking at what they did. They were a wealthy community with a very stagnant downtown, and no new development had occurred for years and years. And the the very large elephant in the room was this morass of zoning and planning codes and processes. And what eventually worked for them was they partnered with a master developer who put up the money to, in conjunction with input from the city, redevelop the entire planning process, lay an overlay zone on the downtown, and develop a master environmental impact report for the whole downtown area. So every new project didn't need its own EIR. In doing all three of those things, they de-risked new development. And as a result, they've now had, this is a few years ago, but they have had billions of dollars of new development that was exactly what they wanted, right? This is not a case of, oh my gosh, we opened the floodgates and now Pandora's box is open and everything's, no, they are getting the results they wanted but that process started with talking with the developers. One more question. Pointing to regulatory tools to clear path for more ADUs has become a popular, easy solution to address housing affordability. Are there one or two solid current studies that can be pointed to that support this argument? Put another way, how confident are we that ADUs will really move the needle?
That's a great question. I'm blanking on case studies on ADUs right now. Let me circle back and maybe we can send a follow-up email on that. I know they've been done.
I hate to keep bringing them up, but Auburn, Maine is a
Yeah.
success story of ADUs. And
Right.
I know that in working with other groups around the country, it is a horrible characterization. ADUs are the gateway drug to housing reform. Okay. It's generally fairly easy. Is it going to solve for all housing shortage issues in a community that has not built as much as it should have built for decades? No, absolutely not. But it is a place to start. And the power of ADUs, at least from my perspective as somebody who's trying to advance change in this space, the power of ADUs are that it allows a city council or a board of supervisors to pass something incremental, peek under the bed, see that there's no monster there a couple of years from now, and maybe then pass something more substantial. It's unless you're talking about a very large metropolitan area, ADUs are not the thousands of units of new housing stock solution in a short period of time. But they are, in the very best sense of the word, the camel's nose under the tent.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, I talk about some of the California data in the Atlantic piece. And it's, the numbers are pretty striking, right? I mean, I think I mentioned this, 1 in 3 homes built in Los Angeles last year was an ADU. That's partly a testament to Los Angeles not building nearly enough housing, but that's partly also a testament to the success of the program. We're getting many thousands of new units being built. And I think exactly to Greg's point, this is relieving pressure. Of course, it's not the scale of new housing production that a city like Los Angeles needs to actually get back to being affordable to regular folks. But it's stopping the bleeding. And it's easing some of the pressure. And I think you're exactly right. I think it actually exposes the possibilities of broader reforms. So it's like, hey, we can actually write rules that allow for a lot of new housing production to occur without necessarily dramatically disrupting the community or dramatically changing individual neighborhoods. This is incremental stuff that folks actually, when they see it, I think what we get into with a lot of these discussions is, we talk in terms of FAR, floor area ratios, or we talk in terms of setbacks. We use all these scary words, and then people imagine the scariest possible development scenario. That's not how I prefer to do a lot of this reform. My preference is to say, find some of these great developments that already exist in your community. Find a home, in Lexington, for example, there were many ADUs that existed before zoning essentially made them illegal. And you could point to them and say, hey, look at this thing, it already exists. Do you think we should actually force this to be demolished? And of course, people would look at you and say, well, no, that's crazy. This is perfectly nice. Or, find a duplex in your community or that type of small townhouse development that might have been built before zoning and say, hey, this is the type of thing that's actually illegal to build today. And it's exactly the type of housing that we need. would it really be the end of the world if we allowed a few more developments like this? And I think people start to get it when they can see it, they can feel it, they know what it means. Some of the conversations around zoning reform get a lot less scary and actually get a lot more exciting.
So we only have a few minutes left. I want to again stress, and I would say this even if he wasn't here looking at me on the screen. Nolan's book is the best book on this subject, precisely because you don't need to have a master's degree in urban design to understand it. It's an outstanding read for city council members, mayors, county supervisors, anybody who wants to get their arms around the big picture of this issue and then think about how it might be applied to their community. It's, if I had the budget, I would send everybody. We've got about 11,000 local elected officials on our list. If I had the budget, I would send every one of them a copy of this book. That's how good it is. Again, for those who are less familiar with BCP, we are here to help. That means not just reading case studies and policy recommendations we send over, but everyone on this call and your staffs and your colleagues are encouraged to pick up the phone and call us if there's any of this that we can help with. We have helped cities and counties across the country sort through some of their challenging policy issues. We are nonpartisan. We are not paid consultants, and we are aligned with your goals of creating thriving and resilient communities. Thanks to everybody who was here. I encourage you follow up if you want more details or have questions about it. And if you got here via a forwarded email from a colleague, drop me an email at greg.brooks@better-cities.org and introduce yourself. Take care, and thanks for all the work you do in your communities. Thank you, Nolan.